If you're a housing provider, you may have noticed an increase in the number of your tenants that have been paying rent late. I'm Mark Cunningham with Grace Property Management, and if that's happening to you, you're not unique in that situation. We've seen a significant increase in the number of our residents that are paying rent late. We've been in operation since 1978, so we have a lot of data to look back on, and it is rare to have this large of a percentage of our residents who are paying rent late. It's not just in Colorado, it's in many states, and data is showing this is trending increasingly late payments of rent. Well, I want to share with you the 4 reasons we believe this is happening, and most importantly, what you as a housing provider should be reacting, how you should be reacting to this. What are the proactive things you can do to ensure that you're protecting your tenants, protecting your property, and minimizing delinquent rents and encouraging tenants to pay on time. So number 1 is we're just seeing a significant slowing of the economy. Now, this is not new. This happens periodically. But for example, there was recently a report by Rutgers that the number of car loan payments is at delinquency is at an all-time high. People are having problems paying their bills. They've incurred a lot of debt. They have car payments. They have other payments. Credit card delinquencies are up dramatically. But the car loan payment, I think, is a very important thing to track, because when people are tight with money, they're going to pay their car payment. They need their car, and they're typically going to pay their rent. Those are some of the last things that they will go delinquent on when things get really tight. Well, they're significantly delinquent, all-time record delinquencies in the subprime area for car loans. What's next? Rental housing. My director of accounting told me the other day she's talked to some tenants who said, well, I have to make my car payment, so I can't make my rent payment. Some tenants will pay their car payment first before their rent payments. But overall, we're seeing a slowdown in economics, slowing in hiring, increase in inflation. It's causing things just the way that is that way. Now, number 2, there's also, at the same time things are slowing down there's reduced governmental aid available to help a lot of these tenants where they have been able to get it in years past. Going back to COVID, the government, both state governments and federal governments, put a lot of money out to help tenants who found themselves in difficult rent-paying situations. That money has dried up. This, for example, is a recent article here in Colorado. It says that the Denver mayor has slashed millions in rental assistance as eviction cases hit record highs. The government is kind of out of money. They don't have the funding federally or national or statewide anymore to help those tenants out in the past. During COVID, we actually did not see a significant decline in on-payment. We saw a decline in on-payments, but not a decline in the actual rents coming through, because the government stepped in to help tenants out when they ran into these situations. That is gone. That safety net of the government paying tenants rent is no longer happening. So that's number 2. Number 3, we're seeing more and more tenants pay late on purpose. And what we mean by that is there's a common understanding of, hey, I don't want to pay my rent late, but what if I do? What if I do pay my rent late? This is a screenshot of a recent article here by one of the major news providers here in Colorado, and their headline story was, how late can you pay rent in Colorado until there's a late fee that the law requires? So this is 2 aspects of things. Number 1, the law in Colorado has made it easier for people to pay rent late before a fee can be imposed. Now, it's important to understand, if you're a tenant, just because a late fee hasn't been imposed, it still can mean you're late per the terms of your lease. But in Colorado, a late fee cannot be charged until the rent is at least 7 days delinquent. That means there's a 7-day grace period. Keeping in mind, if the lease says rent's due on the 1st, it's late on the 2nd. A late fee can't be imposed until the rent is at least 7 days, so landlords can't charge a late fee, but that doesn't preclude the rent from being considered late. Why does that matter? Because if you're a tenant and you pay on the 7th day of the month every single month for a year that you're in a property, and you're technically late, but just you don't get a late fee and you think you're fine, you're going to get a bad housing reference from that landlord when you go to your next housing provider, because they're going to say, no, that tenant paid late every month for 7 months. And the resident may say, well, gosh, I never had a late fee charged. Well, you didn't, because state law doesn't allow a late fee to be charged until the 7th, until the 8th actually, but it was still considered late. And then the late fee per Colorado state law can be no more than $50 or 5% of the rent. So we've seen situations where the tenants look at that and say, well, gosh, the late fee is only $50 or it's only 5% of the rent. I'll just pay late even after. Remember, the late fee can't even be charged until the 7th. And the eviction process has been lengthened out dramatically. So in many cases, a 30-day demand notice has to be posted on the property, and the landlord has to take that payment anytime during the eviction process. If there's a minimal late fee, it really kind of doesn't give a lot of discouraging reasons for a tenant to pay their rent on time. So we're seeing a significant aspect of that. Now, in the past, you'd say, well, those things always happen. There's always slowdowns in the economy. Government doesn't always step in and pay those things on time that way. And we even have sometimes people paying rent on purpose, maybe a little bit late or playing the system a little bit that way. Those things always happen. But one thing that's unique right now is we as landlords, in the past, we could set our own standards on the application quality. Meaning, when everything's great, when the economy's strong and rents are coming in, everybody can pay their rent. But the reason we want to have high criteria on who we place into a rental property isn't to hurt that tenant, but it's to ensure that they're able to pay their rent on time. So for example, the national standard that most landlords have and most housing providers have, if an applicant applies to rent their property, an internal requirement is going to be this. We want to make sure that your income is at least 3 times the amount of the rent. Now that's just one of many requirements or filters that housing providers would have to ensure, not to hurt the resident, but to ensure that you're able to afford this property. It's a protection for those residents as well. So in other words, if the property is running for $1,000 a month, we want to make sure your minimum income per month is $3,000. Very standardized. In Colorado a few years ago, they reduced that. They said housing providers may not require that the income be any greater than 2 times the amount of the rent. So we dropped that standard. That's a significant drop, because think of it yourself. If your income is $4,000 a month, you can't afford a $2,000 a month rental. But the law in Colorado would say, as it relates to the screening criteria on that part of it, they do meet that. So we can't not approve someone because of that. There have been additional requirements placed upon housing providers on the things that we are and are not able to consider in the applicant screening process. For example, if the applicant is subsidized in any form or fashion, we cannot even look at their credit history. Can't pull the credit, can't consider the credit. It is illegal to consider credit history if the applicant is subsidized. Now, the point behind that is folks would say, well, gosh, if they're subsidized, their credit doesn't matter. We know, given 50 years of data, that is a good indicator of the tenant's future ability to pay rent. But we no longer can look at that criteria. So we've had to reduce the standards and the quality, the overall quality, in some individuals that we previously would have said, no, I'm sorry, you don't meet the criteria. This is not a good fit for you. We now have to let that individual in, which when they're making their money and everything's fine, it's great. But when things get rough, those are the first individuals who have trouble paying. It's no fault of their own often. They've just been approved for a property that is a little bit outside of their price range. And then you layer on the top that there's been a lot of fraudulent applications lately. This was an article put out just very recently by a housing provider. It said rental application fraud jumps as high as 50% in some cities, because it's very easy for an individual to apply to rent a property and to create fraudulent information, create fraudulent pay stubs, create all sorts of fraudulent information, and submit that to the housing provider. And some of this fraud information is very good. We recently had an applicant that applied to rent our property. We're processing the information, and they had participated in some of this fraudulent pay stub information. We discovered it. One of the reasons we discovered it is because they sent over their invoice that they paid to the fraudster to create the document for them. So we saw that on that. We're putting things in place as a housing provider to minimize that. But when you put all these things together, it is having a net result of increasing delinquencies for tenants paying rent. Now, what can you as a housing provider do? 3 things. Number 1, you want to be appropriately reasonable with your resident. When your resident comes to you and says, hey, I can't pay rent, or I'm going to pay late, work with them. Be reasonable. We see housing providers typically be unreasonable on one of two extremes. Either they say, absolutely not, I demand it on time, or else I'm going to evict you. That's not a reasonable position. Be reasonable, set up a payment plan. But you also need to be reasonable on the back end. We have landlords and housing individuals that own properties come to us. They want us to manage their property, and they'll have a tenant in place who's 4, 5, 6, 7 months late in their rent because they've drug this out. Be reasonable on both ends. Be reasonable on the front end, but you're also going to have to put requirements in place to ensure that your rent's coming in on your property. Number 2, be very, very precise and be very, very cautious in following the legal process. If you do have to initiate a legal process to evict, there are very precise, very comprehensive rules you must follow. For example, the demand notice has to have certain things in it. It can't have other things in it. If it's in the city of Denver or the county of Denver, it has to have additional addendum. It has to be posted on the property 2 times on 2 separate days. There are many potential pitfalls in the legal process, and you have to be precise and cautious on how you proceed with that, and be very patient. The legal process in Colorado for an eviction is taking a long time. That's another reason we're seeing increased delinquencies, is because people aren't going to move, and it's going to take a long time to get out those rare people who say, I'm not going to pay and I'm not going to move. It's a long legal process, oftentimes, to reclaim your property in that side of things. Now, we want to be clear. Most tenants pay their rent on time. Most tenants who don't pay their rent on time want to pay their rent on time. So in the rare instance when it happens, we want to proceed fairly and proceed cautiously. We believe when property management is performed with integrity and transparency, it's pro-tenant and it's pro-housing provider as well. If you're a client of Grace Property Management, a tenant or a landlord, know that we are doing everything appropriate to be done to protect the property, to ensure that we're reasonable in working with our residents who have problems paying their rent on time. If you're not a client of Grace Property Management, consider us a resource. Visit our website, rentgrace.com. Happy to assist if we're able.